So tonight, it's really, really, really good to be here. I'm going to talk about what we talk about when we talk about race. So that's the title. I'll be using these slides, so if you need to move over here to see these, there'll be quotes and stuff like that, but if you can see them, that's great. Tonight, I'm sure you might have been here last week or a couple weeks ago when Brian Loritz was here teaching. I respect him so much, a friend of mine, and I'm hoping just to build on what he taught on. He came and taught at our staff and our church as well when we were doing our race series, and he's just like the best out there when it comes to this topic. Such a good thinker around this. Now tonight, this talk might hit people differently. For some of you, you may have never really thought about race in America. Maybe, I don't know, you might be, I don't know if there is any immigrants that go to this school, but if you are immigrant, I've found that immigrants don't think about this topic as much in America. They're like, that's an American thing, it's not my thing. That's America's problem, I'm not from here. But they feel like they get immersed in it here, and they get wrapped up into all our junk and all our history. And so you might be an immigrant here tonight and think, well, this doesn't have really that much to do with me. Or for others, you don't think race is an issue. And really the only issue for you is when people try to make everything about race. Like, why does people always make things about race? Why can't it just be, we're just people? Especially living in California, we might think, well, that kind of thing is not necessarily a thing here in California. Maybe in the South and stuff like that, but not here. Others might think that the past is the past. So America may have a very racist past with slavery and what we've done to Native people, but that's behind us now. You have never personally owned a slave, and you haven't killed an indigenous person, so why are people putting that on you? So you might feel that even tonight throughout the teaching. And still others have wrestled with this topic and have been hurt by it and continue to be hurt by it. And you may be glad that Westmont are having this lecture and diving into this. And I just pray that you just have enough stamina to keep going, because this is a really hard topic that takes a lot of energy to have. Now, I imagine as you opted in tonight, most of you in here want to talk about it and probably have a very important point of view when we talk about race. But no matter where you're at on the spectrum, and maybe I didn't even exactly name where you were, why I think it's important for the church to be in this moment right now talking about the gospel and race is this. Next slide. What it means to be a follower of Jesus is really about being reparented into the new family of God. So this is basically what it means to be a Christian. You are, I say this to my congregation often, over and over again, it's about you being reparented into the new family of God. According to Ephesians chapter 2:15, Jesus has come to make a new humanity. Jesus comes to make a new family. And if that is true, then being a disciple of Jesus is learning how to live into this new family. Imagine being brought into a whole new family with all kinds of new rules and new ways of living and being. That's exactly what it's like to become a Christian. Are you with me? That's what Christianity is. Now, part of this right here, being reparented, is learning how to treat each other, how we relate, by taking what we've learned from our past and our family of origin and our culture and laying aside everything that doesn't align with this new family and how it functions and how it relates. Example. Let me give you an example here. Next slide. How did your family of origin process anger? Think about when you were when you lived at home, 2 years ago, or maybe last summer or whatever. Just think about how your family processed anger. Maybe in your family, anger was dangerous and bad. And anyone who was angry viscerally in your family, that was bad. So you will learn to I'm never angry. I take my anger and I push it down deep because anger is bad. Maybe some of your family, like my family, explode in anger to make a point. So the louder you get, the bigger you get in an argument, the more power you have in the room. And so our family would explode in anger, and that's how I was taught to deal with anger. Maybe in your family, sarcasm is an acceptable way to release anger. So you kind of talk into your breath, you're like, yeah, that's why you're the worst, or whatever like that. And you use sarcasm to release anger. Now here's the question. The real question is, how do we do anger in the new family of Jesus? So for me, in the new family of Jesus, I don't do anger by exploding. That is not how Jesus tells me to use anger. I'm not supposed to use anger that way. So you know what I have to do? I have to relearn how to use anger in this new family. Does that make sense? I don't just bring over my family of origin inside the church and go, no, this is how I do anger. Like, well, how does Jesus' new family do anger? That's the question that we need to be asking. Okay, are you with me still? So here's the leap. Here's the leap into the race topic. How did your family culture see race, ethnicity, and dominant culture? How did your family of origin see race, ethnicity, and dominant culture? See, this question right here is, for a lot of people, hard to face and answer. And there are different reasons why this is hard to face and answer. Because maybe if you go here, if you really think about this question, you may have to see your parents in a different light. And that's scary. Or maybe you have to acknowledge some things about your past that you didn't know, you don't even know if you're ready to acknowledge yet. Or maybe this question requires you to acknowledge things about your present. And if you do that, you might start seeing yourself as a bad person. Now, I get all of these things, but according to a lot of the New Testament, this question, no matter how hard it is to face, is a very important question to figure out. So what part of that question needs to be seen, owned, lamented of, repented of, celebrated, or redeemed? How we see race. I'm not just talking to and about white people. I'm talking to all of us. How do we all see race? How are we, next slide, how are we to see race and ethnicity and dominant culture in the new family of Jesus? Maybe our family was subversively racist. Maybe explicitly racist. How do we see race and racism in the new family of Jesus? That's the question. Now, what I'll try to do tonight is I'll try to propose a way forward. It's not the final word, maybe not even the most profound, but I hope enough to move us forward in this conversation. And I have no political agenda. If by that you think I have some liberal or conservative, I am from San Francisco, so you might go, no, you have a political agenda. I do not. I don't have a Democrat or Republican identity politics or anti-America sentiment at all. As a pastor, it is my desire to see people live under the new humanity that Jesus brings us into by his blood on the cross. When Jesus hung on a cross, a Roman centurion pierced his side with a spear to make sure he was dead. And we're told by St. John, the mystical writer of Jesus' story, that the spear went into his side, and then when it did, there was a sudden flow of water and blood. Medically speaking, this is telling the centurion that Jesus was dead. But spiritual writers have always taken this to mean that at the moment of Jesus dying on the cross, he was in reality giving birth to the church, water and blood. My wife just had a baby 7 months ago. There was a lot of water and a lot of blood. And I don't really want to talk more about that than that. Jesus is giving birth to the church right here. We are, by Jesus' blood, a new family. We are a new humanity. That's reality. That is true. And there is no greater healing and peacemaking work to be done in our nation than around the idea of race. And we as followers of Jesus should be the place where Christ's kingdom has come and his will is being done in this area as it is in heaven. So what will that be? What will heaven be like? You might know this, but heaven will be like this. Revelation 5:9. And they sang a new song saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain and bought, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth." This is the heavenly vision. Your ethnicity, by the way, is eternal. You will be your ethnicity in heaven. We say in our church in San Francisco as it is in heaven, we are working towards a day where every people from every tribe, tongue, nation, language are all brought underneath the power of the gospel in Jesus. Now, but for this to happen on earth as it is in heaven, we have to do a few things. A few things that the gospel has done since the beginning. And this is what I want to do tonight. I'm going to name some walls, and I want to talk about tearing down some walls. Naming walls and tearing down walls, the church has been doing since the beginning. So I'm going to read you Ephesians 2. And Paul here is naming the walls that divide people in the church. And what you see Paul doing is working to tear these walls down. So I think Brian might have taught through this passage for you last week, did he? Was it Ephesians 2 that he did? I don't remember. He did it with our church. It was brilliant when he did it. But let me read it to you and talk about naming some walls. Paul says, therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in the flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to those who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. So here, what Paul is doing is he's naming the wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, a wall that you and today might call racist prejudice that existed between Jew and Gentile. And there was hostility between these two groups of people. And what Paul argues over and over again, like one of the first implications of the gospel, is tearing down this wall that separated these two groups of people. And he says that in Jesus, absorbed the wrath of God, the anger of humanity. Literally, Romans and Jews got together to kill Jesus. Jesus absorbed that in himself and divides the walls that separate these two groups of people. Now, naming these walls and tearing down these walls is gospel work that still remains today. We have to do this work with the gospel. Name the walls. Here are the walls. Paul names them. There's the walls. Hostility between Jew and Gentile. We need to name the walls in our society, and with gospel motivation and gospel power, not be afraid to tear these walls down. Especially if you are part of the dominant culture, we have to do this work. Now, so allow me to name some walls. What I'm about to say next and dive into might be difficult for some of you to hear. It isn't easy to ask critical questions about our country's origin or our own family of origin. So during these next moments, you may feel frustrated or maybe defensive or angry or sad or defeated or overwhelmed. If you do, I hope that you use it as an opportunity to embrace tension and discomfort, because transformation rarely comes easy. So embrace this. So what I want to do tonight, I want to talk about what we talk about when we talk about race. Now, it's best to, when you talk about race, to contrast it, to put race in contrast with ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to the way people identify with each other based on commonalities and distinctives like language, history, ancestry, nationality, customs, cuisine, and art. Ethnicity is what you get back when you do a 23andMe or Ancestry.com DNA stuff. That traces your ethnicity. So for example, when my wife got her 23andMe results, it didn't say 100% white, because that's not what it does. That's not ethnicity. It said French, Eastern European, etc. That is ethnicity. Race is something completely different. Race is a social construct. Race is not found in our blood. It's not put there by God, but created by human beings. Let me explain this. There was a time when white people weren't white people. White people were German and Scottish and British and Russian and French and Italian and so on. And to try and see them at that time through a single racial lens would have been inconceivable. But the colonization of America by Europeans changed everything. Before that time, race as we know it today did not exist. What happened is what Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative Act, coined as the narrative of racial difference. The narrative of racial difference. That is, differences in race were assigned value and worth. A hierarchy was established based on racial differences to make room for two horrific historical realities. One, slavery, and 2, the annihilation of native people. Race and racial difference is a social construct designed to grant value to some and not to others. It was at this time during the colonization of America that ethnic cultural distinctives such as German and British and Italian and so on began to be de-emphasized, and white people began to be seen as a collective group who were inherently superior to people of color, especially black slaves and brown native people. That means the consequences of this meant that some people were seen as superior and others were inferior. Namely, white people were seen as inferior, people of color were seen as inferior. Some were seen as human and others were seen as less than human. Race as a social construct was a necessary theory to make white Christian people feel comfortable with their ownership of other human beings and their attempted extinction of native people groups. How else can you, with an understanding of Genesis 1 and 2, which Christians did, and the gospel of Jesus, how can you as a Christian justify the removal of people from their land and the enslavement of people based on the color of their skin? You must make them less human than you. That's the only way you can do it. And this is exactly what we see happen. For example, in our Declaration of Independence, it says this, and you might know this, but I'll say it anyway. This is what the Declaration of Independence says. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is a noble vision, at least for men, right? All men are created equal, since it did not include women, by the way. However, the declaration of the description, of people indigenous to the land was not so kind and promising. This is what it goes on to say. The inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. It says that in the Declaration of Independence. According to the Declaration of Independence, Native Americans were dehumanized as merciless savages who stood in the way of westward expansion. So all men are created equal, endowed by God, but Indians, native people, are merciless savages. That's not human. How do you justify the genocide of a group of people who were here before you in a land that you now wanted to inhabit? The only way you can do that was to dehumanize them, because this is not how God sees humanity. This is not how the doctrine of the Imago Dei plays itself out. How do you justify enslaving a people based on their skin color? You have to do the same thing. This is splashed across the pages of our U.S. Constitution as well. Written during the height of slavery in America, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, it says this about people of African descent. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bought to serve for a term of years, and excluding Indian not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. Now, you guys know this. We know this as the 3/5 compromise. You might have heard of this. African Americans were considered 3/5 human. Think about that for a second. White people were 100% human. Indians were 0% human. And African American, black people, were 3/5 human. Now, you may say, well, no, this was only placed there by our founders to negotiate the tax system. Okay? That's usually what people come back and say. No, this had all to do with taxes. Okay, so then you're saying that white people and people of color were seen as the same, and there was no historical dichotomy between black and white life. What about the legal principle referred to as the one-drop rule, which said any person with even one drop of sub-Saharan African blood was to be considered black, making the message very clear by law. Whites were the superior race, and even one single drop of inferior blood contaminated the purity of whiteness. Okay, so this is pretty heavy, so let's step back and review. One time, people were German and Italian and British and so on. But in this new world of America, they became white and superior to people of color. And thus was born the ideology of race. So when we talk about race, we are talking about an ideology that's so deeply embedded in the imagination of America that it's impossible to see life without it. I like to quote the late author David Foster Wallace in his commencement address, where he says, "This is water. This is water. This is what you and I swim in all day, every day. To see life without this, you can't. This is in everything." Jamar Tisby, in his book The Color of Compromise, says, "Race is a social construct. There is no biological basis for the superiority or the inferiority of any human being based on the amount of melanin in his or her skin. The development of the idea of race required the intentional actions of people in social, political, and religious spheres to decide that skin color determined who would be enslaved and who would be free. Over time, Europeans, including Christians, wrote laws and formed the habits that concentrated power in the hands of those they considered white, while withholding equality from those they considered black. Race is a socially constructed system based on skin color to give inherent value to some people and not to other people." So if that's race, what is racism? Racism is a system, next slide, a system of advantage based on race. Racism is a system of advantage based on race. So yeah, just keep that there for a second. If we are working to disrupt racism, and I think we should as a Jesus community, it's hard to disrupt something when we don't know what it is. Or when we know what it is, but it's so insidious that it hides in plain sight. Now, so what I want to do is I'm going to talk about this here in a second. And to do this, I'm going to do some sociology, but I also land on why it's important that we talk about this and disrupt it as a church. So first, a stereotype. So I think you need to know the difference between a stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Okay? You might know, but review for some of you guys that don't. First of all, a stereotype is a belief that associates a group of people with certain traits. So people, these are basically, a stereotype is a thought. Think of it like this, it's a thought. Stereotypes are a thought we have towards other people that are not necessarily based on race. For example, all women are nurturing is a stereotype. Another stereotype, all progressive people are woke. That's a stereotype, right? That's what you think. Like, oh, you're progressive, you must be super woke, or something like that, right? All these are beliefs that can be both positive and negative, but they're thoughts. A prejudice is a feeling. A prejudice is a negative feeling towards persons based on their membership to certain groups. Prejudice is a feeling that we feel negatively and it's experienced negatively. For example, black men are dangerous. That is a prejudice, a negative feeling that people literally feel when they have a prejudice towards black men. Or Latino women are irrational. That's a prejudice. That's a feeling you get when you're like, when a Latina's talking loud, like, oh, you're getting irrational. That's a feeling. It's a prejudice. Now, discrimination is a behavior. So a stereotype is a thought, a prejudice is a feeling, discrimination is what you do with this, a behavior directed against persons because of a membership to a certain group. So a woman clutching her purse when she sees a black man walk by is discrimination. It's a behavior. Actually, Brian Lorch told me that story that happened to him a few weeks ago. Walking in the store in the Bay Area, I mean, super progressive Bay Area place. He walks in the store, and a lady walks past him and sees him and clutches her purse. Another black friend of mine at church a couple of Sundays ago goes and receives communion, turns around, walks up, and this girl has her purse, an empty chair next to her, sees him, grabs it, and puts it on the other side. Like that's discrimination. Not dating someone who was white because they are not Chinese or vice versa. That's discrimination. This is the behavior that you do this. Now, anyone can have these. Doesn't matter who you are. Racism is another thing. Racism is when people in power are prejudiced or discriminate based on race or ethnicity. So think of racism as prejudice or discrimination plus power. Now, this is hard for some people to get their mind around because there are some different schools of thought here. There are some people that will say that anyone can be racist. You can be black and racist, white and racist, Mexican and racist. Anyone can be racist. But the overwhelming majority of sociologists and thinkers on this will say only dominant culture can be racist. So in America, it's white culture. White is dominant culture. Only white people can be racist in this paradigm. Now, there's some people that disagree with this. There's tons of people in my own church when I taught this that disagree with me, like angrily disagreed with me. But the overwhelming majority of sociologists say, in America, white can only be racist. Let me give you an example. My wife, Ashley, and I went to school together in Bakersfield, where we're from. And the school that we went to, my wife was white. The school that we went to was a majority black and Hispanic school. She was a minority as a white woman. She was bullied in junior high and high school for being white. What happened to her was racial prejudice, and it was horrible. It was a horrible experience for her. Now, the reason why semantics are important here and saying she was bullied, what's the point of like semantically saying, well, why can't she call what Ashley went through racism? The point is that she was bullied and that's horrible, and she also grew up as a part of dominant culture still. Even though she grew up relatively poor, most of all her teachers, principals, coaches, and the police officers that pulled her over when she was speeding over and over again in high school and let her off time and time again were mostly all white. She was still part of white culture. Even though she was a minority at our school, our teachers were majority white, principals were majority white, police officers were majority white. She grew up in white dominant culture, even though she was racially prejudiced against in high school. Does that make sense? So you couldn't say, well, they treated her, they were racist. The Mexican girls that made fun of her, the black girls, they were racist. No. They were they had racial prejudice for sure. They bullied for sure. But Ashley was still part of dominant white culture. Now, this is why I think I share the story of my wife and what she experienced growing up is to say that it wasn't reverse racism, but it was racial prejudice and bullying, because racism by and large is prejudice plus power. Now, I want to name this wall that I've just named. I want to name this wall American history. So if we're naming the walls that divide us, everything I just kind of walked through was called that American history. And by history, I don't mean it's in our past, like it's over with and it has no bearing on our present. If you've ever heard of anything, have you ever heard of family of origin? We all come from a family of origin. And our families have a way of living inside of us. We are not just an autonomous self. We are all impacted by what was going on in our family going back to a few generations. We have history in our bone and in our blood. And that patterns our whole life scripts. They've been kind of passed down. The patterns in the life scripts have been passed down from generation to generation. And you're living in that today, even being unconscious of it. I would say in the same way, our culture's history and our nation's history is passed down to us without us even knowing it. And it lives in our bones. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So we have to face this in order to change it. Now, I don't care how woke you think you are or non-racist, this lives in your bones. This lives in all of our bones. Actually, in my research on this, I read a lot of books, but the one book that I read was called White Fragility. And the author points out that She was a white woman who wrote this. She points out that progressive people are some of the worst carriers of racism and implicit bias because they don't think they are. They think they're woke. I'm like, no, I'm woke. I'm not racist, I'm woke. Actually, you're the worst carrier of racism because you think you're woke. Ignorance is what makes racism so insidious. If we could just own it and say, yeah, I'm a part of American culture, therefore racism lives in me in different ways, and I need to name it always and be rooting it out always for the sake of the gospel. And the quicker you realize that racism is in your bones, even as progressive West Coasters, the quicker you can notice it in your own heart and do gospel work to tear that wall down. So, my wife and I, as we've been going through this, we host dinners with all kinds of kind of multicultural people that go to our church, and my wife, being white, is always asking questions. In my community group, recently, there's permission to be racist in our community group, meaning we have to root it out. So let's get it out. And so even in my community, we had a lady, a woman in my community group. My community group I meet with weekly are very, very close. I'm Latino. There's another Latina who's in our community group. And we have another friend, and she's white. And so she was telling us, we're going through this stuff, and she's like, you know what's funny, Dave, I don't see you or this other gal who's Latina. She says, I don't see you two as being Mexican at all. I kind of just see you as being like me. Like, I kind of see you as white. We're like, well, that's really offensive. Like, why is that offensive? I'm like, because you basically just gave us a white card. You're like, oh, you're like me, I'm going to give you a white card. And because you're successful and you own a house and all this stuff, I'll just consider you white. You have a white card. I'm like, that's dishonoring to us completely. I'm Mexican. She's Mexican. And we're both going, and this is why there's permission to be racist. Because you might not even know you do that. You're like, oh no, I don't even see you as a brown person. I just see you kind of as kind of a white person. Well, why? Where's that coming from? This is really important. Like, well, no, because I don't see color, that's why, right? And what that really means is that you don't see you're white. White people never think that they're white. They're just like, I'm just normal. I'm not. I'm just normal. That's what I am. And this is why you need to name it. Always be naming it. Name it, even if it gets tiring and exhausting, to name it. So, this lives in our bones, in our history. Daniel Hill, the author of Wide Awake, another great book, he says, the system of race that we've created in America is fraught with sin, and it has played a powerful role in shaping the sense of identity of every human being who has lived here. Therefore, it would be naive for devoted followers of Jesus to believe that they can pursue the transformation of identity in Christ without also acknowledging the power of sin as evidenced by impact of race. Our old self has been profoundly shaped by race, and we can't grow into the new and redeemed self without naming the presence of that sin, confessing the ways it has impacted us, and doing all we can to break free of its former power. That is so good. Like, hey, you want to talk about like transformation? You have to own racism if you want to transform to become in the image of Christ. We have to name our history. So, the first wall is our history. The second wall I want to name tonight is complicity. And here I'm speaking specifically of the church in America, which we are a part of. If you are a follower of Jesus and you're a part of Jesus' church, we're all part of this. I'm a part of this. We have to name our complicity with the race and racism. From the 1600s to the present day, the American Christian church has been complicit in very specific and pivotal ways that allow racism to survive and embed itself in our society. You are typically told that the church, it was the church that worked to take down slavery and segregation and overt acts of racism in this country. And to some degree, that is true, depending on the stream of church that you're talking about. But it's also true, and probably more true, that the church had more to do with the formation of slavery, segregation, and racism before it did anything to tear it down. And we have to own that. So in the 1600s, the church in America debated if slaves even had souls and could receive the gospel and be baptized. In 1667, many slave owners who were Christian did not want the gospel preached to their slaves because it was a long-standing custom in England that Christians, being spiritual brothers and sisters, could not enslave one another. And if slaves converted to Christianity in America, since Christianity had inherent ideas of human equality embedded in its teaching, would slaves not begin to demand their freedom and social equality? So slave owners did not want their slaves evangelized, but missionaries were putting pressure on slave owners to evangelize their slaves. So here's the compromise. The New Virginia Assembly law that was enacted in September 1667, called the Key Slavery Statute, said this: "It is enacted and declared by this Grand Assembly and the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom." So missionaries and pastors told newly converted slaves to be content with their spiritual liberation and to remain slaves at the same time. Now, side note here. Slavery in America was a completely different kind of slavery than we see in history and in the Bible. Now, not to say that slavery was good throughout world history, but American slavery was a specific kind of slavery that was different. In most cases, slaves could legally marry, own property. They worked for a specific term, not a lifetime. Slaves in other cultures were not born into servitude. They might offer their labor in order to pay off debt. They were captured in war. Slavery was not exclusively a matter of race or necessarily ethnicities in other cultures either. Anyone could be a slave. American slavery turned into something different. So I share the pivotal moment in 1667 because here was the message. And the message that has imbibed itself insidiously in the imagination of mainly white Christian evangelicals ever since. I share that to share this. This is like literally has been the mantra that has imbibed itself into white culture, white Christian culture. Preach to the soul, leave the system alone. Preach to the soul. Yeah, this actually is today. This is preach to the soul, liberate the soul, but leave the system alone. Don't touch the system. Let touch the soul. That actually got into that culture in 67. We're like, okay, here it is. You can be free and liberated in your soul, but you will remain a slave, and we're not going to mess with the system. This happened through the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, leaders in the Great Awakening, one of America's greatest revivals, they both owned slaves. Whitefield early on denounced slavery, but later in his life, by the late 1740s, had purchased a plantation in the South and bought slaves to work in it, so that all the profit, since he didn't have to pay for their labor, could go to supporting an orphanage ministry. Think about that. He went on in Georgia to petition for slavery and said that Georgia can never be a flourishing province unless Negroes are employed. And by employed, he didn't mean paid, he meant made use of. Point being, there was a system, financial, economic, social, political system that you must leave alone because it works. But we can preach to the soul, but leave the system. And that went on from the antebellum era through the Civil War, through the Jim Crow era, all the way to the Civil Rights Movement. From lynchings to bombings and to every other unthinkable thing in between, the church has been complicit in this lie. Preach to the soul, leave the system. On Good Friday, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, for leading peace marches and boycotts in Birmingham, what King called the most segregated place in the whole country. While he was in jail, 8 white pastors wrote a letter to King, published in the newspaper, advising them to depart and let the community handle race relations itself. Now, here's the thing. The letter was reasonable. It contended that civil rights remedies should be pursued through the courts instead of boycotts and marches. It was the reasonableness of the letter that reveals the underlying problem of complicity with racism. We're like, can you leave? Let us handle this. We're pastors. We'll handle this through the courts. This is reasonable. We'll do this. In Dr. King's response letter, famously known as a letter from Birmingham jail, he says this: "I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right and the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the secular and the sacred, the sacred and the secular. Now, what is Dr. King saying? MLK is saying, I'm tired of hearing, since 1667, preach to the soul and leave the system alone. I'm tired of people saying that over and over again, separating bodies and souls, separating sacred and secular. Okay, so all of this, I would imagine, is heavy. I'm sure some of you have thought through this and the implications of this, but what's the hope? What's the hope of Jesus' church? How can the hope in the church be the hope for the world? I want to close by reading 1 Corinthians 12. You might know this as the spiritual gifts passage. Everyone knows 1 Corinthians 12 is the spiritual gifts passage. Paul is explaining how we need all the gifts in his church to be functioning and what he calls the body of Christ. Verse 12, 1 Corinthians 12, just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. So this is kind of like what we get, like the idea of the church is the body of Christ, and you're a hand, and I'm a foot, and I'm a mouthpiece, and we're an ear, and eye, and everyone's important, right? And we kind of take that to mean spiritual gifts, like you have the gift of healing, I have the gift of hospitality, I have the gift of leadership, I have the gift of administration, and we all work together, and we all form the body of Christ. But actually read it in context. Look at verse 12, or verse 16, sorry. If the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body. It would not be for that reason to stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts but one body. Now, we kind of know Paul's whole argument here. But we often skip over verse 13, the lens which Paul wants us to see the entire passage. Look at verse 12 and 13. Just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized into one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. And we are all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but many. So, I promise you this is in the Bible. You can look it up yourself when you get back to your dorm or something tonight. What is Paul saying? He is saying, I want you to read this through the lens of race and class. We always read the body passage through the lens of spiritual gifts. Like, oh, no, I have the gift of teaching, you have the gift of worship, and I think you have the gift of greeting. But Paul says, no, I actually want you to look at it through the lens of race and class. This is not just a spiritual gifts passage. But what Paul is also saying that unless the body is a multi-ethnic and cuts across classism, then his body isn't as diverse as God desires it to be. He wants a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-class church. So when we think of an eye and a nose and a foot and a hand, we have to be thinking both spiritual gifts and multi-ethnic reality of Christ's body. This is what this is saying. David Anderson, pastor of a multi-ethnic church and author of the book Gracism. You know David Anderson? No? He takes some liberties on this passage of Scripture and tries to highlight the multi-ethnic reality of the body of Christ. Listen, this is amazing. He's basically paraphrasing this passage, but he wants you to understand the multi-ethnic reality. He says this. Now, the body is not made up of one culture but many. If the blacks should say to the whites, because I am not white, I do not belong to the body, it would not make it true. The blacks would still be a part of the body, whether they vote for the same candidates or not. And if the whites should say, because I'm not black, I do not belong to the body, it would not make it true. The whites should still be part of the body, whether they clap their hands and shout loudly in church or not. It doesn't mean they are not filled with the Spirit. If the whole body was tightly structured, where would the sense of spontaneity be? If the whole body was spontaneous, where would the sense of order be? As it is, there are many parts and many cultures, but one body. The Cuban church cannot say to the Haitian church, I don't need you. The Puerto Rican church cannot say to the Mexican church, I don't need you. The Pakistanis cannot say to the Persians, I don't need you. The Japanese cannot say to the Koreans, I don't need you. The suburban church cannot say to the urban church, I don't need you. The city church cannot say to the country church, I don't need you. Jews cannot say to Arabs, I don't need you. Palestinians cannot say to Jews, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are not to be dismissed or discarded as if they don't matter. They are God's special instruments of honor to reveal an aspect of God that would otherwise be seen or experienced. There really is no part of the Christian body that is to be dismissed as unimportant. They all matter. If Palestinian Christians suffer, we all suffer. If South African Christians are freed from apartheid, we all rejoice with them. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. Isn't that beautiful? Like capturing the multi-ethnic. And here's what I love about America and the opportunity we have as a nation. We are a very diverse nation. Not the most diverse. We fall somewhere in the middle of the most diverse nations in the world. However, we are a diverse country. And we have a real opportunity to live into a multicultural reality of God's new family made up of people from different tribes, languages, peoples, and nations. And to be that, we have to use these scriptures and their implications as a mirror to help us see the racial and ethnic hostility and supremacy of our time and how we must disrupt that. So in closing, I was reading an activism book a couple months ago by a San Francisco local writer and artist. Her name was Jenny Odell, and she's a Stanford prof. This book is called How to Do Nothing. In the intro, she makes the argument that before we can do anything useful, we must stop and first learn to do nothing, to disentangle ourselves from our culture and society's value system, and become what she called resistance in place. She writes that to resist in place is to make oneself into a shape that cannot easily be appropriated by our current value system. I think this is really prophetic. To resist in place here looks like not becoming the shape of our current conversations, whether that's anger, dismissal, name calling, or shaming. Resisting in place means to stay in this place, no matter how uncomfortable, and lament and repent. And to do that with neither optimism of the American dream nor the pessimism of America's sin. Because we're God's new family. I think of Leslie Newbegin and what he said when he was asked, is he an optimist or a pessimist? He says, I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. Like it changes, Jesus Christ, his being risen from the dead changes everything. I'm not an optimist going, oh, we live in America and we can change. No, I'm not a pessimist going, it's never going to change. Jesus risen from the dead. It changes the paradigm. It changes the conversation. And so, and I've said I'm closing like 8 times, but for real. What to do next? I found this to be, Jamar Tisby in his book, Color of Compromise, uses the ARC system as a way of moving forward in this conversation. ARC, A-R-C, stands for awareness, relationships, and commitment. Awareness means, especially for people who are dominant culture, white, do your work, do your homework, read books. Read books and listen to podcasts would be probably, most people of color say that's probably the most important thing that white people can do because, to quote, I'm totally forgetting her name right now. I'll remember in a second. She opens her book by saying white people are exhausting because white people can be. Who is it? Austin, yes, Austin Brown, right? And she says it's really important that white people do their work like reading books, listening to podcasts, because they're always trying to ask people of color how they feel about this, how they feel about that. They can get kind of exhausting sometimes. So the best thing to do is like first make an aware, like read books like Color of Compromise and Wide Awake and White Fragility, and like read those books and then start to build relationships. Don't use your relationships to build awareness, because sometimes that can get really exhausting. Do awareness and then start building relationships. And then make a commitment. Start making commitments to like for example, my wife and I have a commitment. Every single time we throw a dinner party, there's diversity in around their table. We'll never throw only white people and only married people. Like, we won't ever do that. There's always a mix of different ethnicities around the table, and people with kids and no kids and single people. Always. Like we just won't mono anything around. Like that's not Christ's kingdom. Like there's always this different. And so we're like, and it feels a little weird, but I think about that. I'm like, oh, we're inviting this person. No, we need to invite this person because it can't be all white people. And we have to invite this person because it can't be all married people. And that's really important. So you have to make a commitment to a certain kind of thing. That's the commitment my wife and I have made when we're having people over our house for dinner. Like it's going to be multicultural, whatever. I'm done. Thank you for your patience. I know that was really long.
So I wrestled a lot with, I'm half Mexican, half white, and I had friends that were like, oh, you're not really Mexican, you don't speak Spanish, you're white. And when I defend myself and say, no, I'm not white, people perceive me as Mexican, and that means a few different things, a common response was like, so why do you find so much identity and pride in your ethnicity when we're just supposed to find it in being Christian and like being children of God? Like, why are you so defensive about your ethnicity when that's not our truest identity? What would do you have a response to that?
Yeah. My first response is because ethnicity is a part of who I am, and it's a part of how God's made me. Like, for example, if you turn that around and use that argument for being a male or female, that would fall apart. Like, why are you taking so much pride in being a woman? Yeah. Like, they wouldn't say that. Yeah. Like, that's a part of who you are. That's actually something that will live in the eschaton, that will live forever. When God makes the new heavens and new earth, you're going to be a Latina woman in heaven. Like, if you have them think about that. So it's a part of my identity because Christ has made it a part of my identity. Now, is it the most important part of my identity? No, but it is a part of my identity, and the way that I'm perceived in the world as a woman and as being Latina is a thing. And so owning that and understanding that and then wrestling that down is a really important thing to me, and should be to you as well, because that's who I am. That sort of thing.
How do you have these kind of conversations with, especially white people who are really resistant to this kind of especially I know I have a couple extended family who probably would be really defensive or uncomfortable with this kind of conversation. So how do you move forward in that kind of relationship?
Oh, gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that question. That's a really, really hard one, especially people that don't want to have this conversation or are pretty blindly, racist. That's a really hard word to use. I think subtle. What I try to do is when I'm around people that tend to say things that are off color, racist, whatever, subtly point it out, or don't show my complicity by laughing at a joke or taking part in the conversation. Make it known through my body language, oh, this isn't right, this isn't okay, this is not okay. Not by completely destroying the relationship and freaking out and adding fuel to the fire through anger, but by my body language, and I won't laugh, and I'm that's slightly racist. I'll say something like that. If it's a friend, if it's a family member, I get in this with a few of my family members as well, and that's a harder one for me. I'm not mature enough to not get angry yet. I hope I get there. I had an incident with my neighbor recently that I was on the phone with one of my best friends, and I was sitting in front of her house because she lives across the street from me, but she is the owner of the house and she doesn't live there, and I've never met her in my life. And she's looking at me and she gives me the look you look like a dangerous Mexican sitting in front of my house, scoping it out, like that kind of thing. And I'm on the phone, and I roll down my window, and I'm on the phone, because I was in there for like 10 minutes, and she's looking at me the whole time. And I'm used to that look growing up. I've seen that look before. And I just get angry. I mean, I'm like angry at her. I'm just showing you my like own sin, my own like. And so I roll in the window, and she's like, "Are you lost?" I'm like, "No, I own that house. What are you doing here?" Because I've never seen her before. I'm like, "Do you own this house?" She's like, "Yeah." She walks away. And my best friend goes, "Wow, way to be neighborly." And I'm like, "I'm so sorry, man. I'm just so like that. I'm not mature enough to not get angry about that still. One day I hope to be. I'm still growing in that. So I try to point it out as nice as I can, and sometimes I don't do a good job. But I think it's our responsibility to point it out.
How do you respond to people who are of like white culture when other races like Mexicans and like black people get together to celebrate who they are? I feel like sometimes, a lot of times, whites are like, well, what's my culture? Like, I want to celebrate me, and like, how come you guys get to celebrate you? Like, how do you respond to that kind of like person that's like that? Because I've had people say that to me, like, how come you get to like celebrate yourself, but I don't get to celebrate my like ethnicity?
Yeah, I would first. I think that's a really good thing. I usually try to harness the passion as much as you can. Like, I think God is like ultimate. You know, judo. Like, you harness the energy of the other person to flip them on their back, sort of thing. I think the Holy Spirit does that the best. Harnessing their energy, like, oh, you're passionate about learning about your ethnicity as being a white person. You should probably do that. So what does that look like for you? You own your whiteness. Understanding you're white is a really big thing, because most white people don't know they're white. They just think they're normal. So what does it mean for you to be white? What does that mean? And what does it look like for you to celebrate aspects of your culture? Take a 23andMe test and know your true ethnicity, because ethnicity and race are different things. Let's talk about your ethnicity. And you should probably understand how white people show up in America. That's probably an important thing too. And typically, brown and black people historically, they need to celebrate because they've been looked down on so often, so much. So part of the celebration is like pulling them up out from the way white people have looked at them. So it's that sort of thing. So for you to say, stop making it about you, make it about me, is part of white culture. So like, learn that, and then learn how to undo that. So that's the thing that I found the most. Like, when white people get uncomfortable at our church around this, it was only because the girl who wrote White Fragility calls it white fragility. That's like, I don't know what it's like to like someone look at me like I'm white. I don't want you to look at my color. I don't want that. But that's what people of color do all the time. Like, that's their life, right? And so when white people have to face that, it's really disrupting at first. But it's an important work. It's an important part of the process. So I would try to do that in a nice way, harness that energy, and like, yeah, you probably should. What's your ethnicity? Talk to me about your ethnicity. What does being white in the world look like to you? That sort of thing. Yeah.
How can an institution move past conversations and get to mobilizing and putting words into actions to actually facilitate change? How do you recommend an institution do that?
So I can only speak to my institution, the church. I can't speak to a college institution because I have no idea how that honestly even works. But I'll speak to the institution of the church. So it does take people in power to do it. Because when it works from the margin, all that happens is a tension that will end in like tectonic earthquakes that I found. So it has to be, we have a couple people in our church of color who have tried to get people in power to have this conversation for years, and slowly got into where we were having these conversations as like elders and leaders and staff. And once it got there, then systemic change was able to happen. But if it was only working at the margins, it was only just people getting angry at each other all the time. So pointing the finger. So it was done through really good, healthy relationships, all the way to a point where it got to like people of power, like the elders of the church, like myself. And then it was like, here's a book to read, and here's this to read, and deep dive on that. So it took me about a year and a half of conversations, dinners, and research. And then from there, it was like, Tyler, who's our worship pastor, is here, like, how do we change everything from music? How do we change like our community groups that are neighborhood based, which also is socioeconomically based, to get more diverse? How do we make sure that there's diversity on the stage represented all the time? We have a very diverse eldership right now. How do we remain diverse? Like, we're looking at bringing on some more elders, and we have to make sure that the white to non-white ratio stays really good. Like right now we only have one white person on our elder board, and he's South African, so he's white, but like South African, you know? So we're adding, to answer your question, I'm kind of getting tangenty. It has to work through relationships. If you're people from the margins, through relationships, conversations, and then it has to eventually get to the people in power for them to see it. But it has to happen around dinner table. It has to happen around tables. It has to happen around fellowship and conversations. That's what I found most helpful. I have one of our close friends, her name is Janet. She worked at Twitter, now works at Facebook in diversity. She's Nigerian born, but raised in LA. And she's a master at this, and it's all done through relationship. Kind, so gracious, and she's just working from the margins, but all through relationship, through like peaceful like suggestions and affirmation. She doesn't like, it's not through anger.
As a person who's like part of a minority, how do you feel having to constantly play the game of like, oh, I have to be aware of, having, this person in the same room together, but we can't have too many of these people, we can't have too many of these people. So like, how does that affect you? And like, how do you know, like, how do you feel about having to play that position of like, I'm the minority, but I still have to like make exceptions and like, I guess, comfort the other people?
Yeah. I always think about it in terms of values. So if I'm doing it through like rigidity and like law, then I think that it's not driven by the right motivation. But if I value God's kingdom that is diverse, then that's going to lead me to go, oh, because God's kingdom is a diverse kingdom, and I value that, I'm going to make decisions based on that. It's not like it has to be 20% Asian and 20% Mexican, and that's not really what drives me as much as like God's kingdom is a diverse kingdom, and I value that diversity. So I'm gonna lead through that. So I don't think it is as sterile as like, well, it has to be this, that, this. It's like I want there to be like a true makeup of our city, represented in leadership and elders and on the stage and all that stuff, who I invite to come teach and that. Yeah. So I don't ever look at it as like, oh, you're our token person. I have to work past that. Like, we had to do this with women in leadership at our church as well, like making sure there's always a woman leading from the stage. And that can get tokenized. Like, people, oh, that's the token woman. I'm like, no, this person leads in our church and needs to be on stage leading from the stage. We value making sure that our stage matches what happens in our church. So it's just value-based versus like tokenized, like checking boxes.
So you mentioned diversity several times, and diversity is a hot topic for Westmont right now. We're very fixated on the concept of diversity. And currently, Westmont is on this mission of what I'll name as racial diversity. But I'm curious, as someone who has gone through an institution, your church, and has kind of reshaped it, what is the value and what are some steps that we can take institutionally to promote cultural diversity as well as we are trying to promote racial diversity?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is a difference between racial diversity and cultural diversity. We try to use the word multicultural, not necessarily multiracial, because you can be different races but the same culture. So our church is very multiracial but monocultural. So we just did a survey, and we're technically a multi-ethnic church by all measures, but our culture is a very white dominant culture. So we're trying to go, how do we change that? How do I, as someone who's Mexican, like embrace that part, and everything from my theology, who I read, to who I quote, again, music. I think those things are really, really important. Also, Christina Cleveland said this. She was lecturing at our church once, and she said, typically, white culture is like defined by like strategic thinking, upfront leadership, really good executive skills, language that is clear and linear, and so that means for me, I have to make room for that, not that, in leadership. So if someone's not a linear thinker like me and is more and values a lot more messy and kind of like spontaneous leadership style, you have to kind of embrace that. That's really hard too, because you kind of want your leaders to be like this kind of certain leader that has this kind of interpersonal skills and this kind of like upfront skills. But when you're a multicultural church, that changes. So Asian culture leads different than white culture. Black culture leads different than white culture. And you have to embrace those cultures and let them lead in their own, like the way they were brought up in their culture. That's harder for us, for me, to be honest, because there's like a certain thing I think is a good leader, but I think oh, dominant white culture leader. That make sense?
Yeah.
So how to do that? You have to just make space for it, always, like making space. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about conflict and anger. We would all agree that we don't want to lead from a place of anger.
Yeah.
It's rarely productive. I also think within the Christian community we have a phobia around conflict.
Yeah.
And avoiding conflict.
Yeah.
Often I think we avoid it because we don't trust, or if we could trust that conflict doesn't mean end of relationship,
Yeah.
we could maybe stay with it.
Yeah.
And I wonder too whether part of relationship commitment awareness also grants, particularly for our non-dominant culture brothers and sisters, a place for them to express their anger and for us to absorb it.
Yeah.
Not respond back to it.
Totally.
But also, jihadi wisdom within the community, this is sort of broader
Yeah.
question. How can we, to engage this issue, nobody bypasses conflict.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's a good way of putting
the
it.
community knows as much about that as anybody.
Yeah.
How do we sort of acknowledge that conflict is part of relationship?
Yeah.
And we don't need to run away from it or fear it or engage in a cult of niceness
Yeah.
that just hovers over the reality.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think, even with what you said, understanding that relationships will just breed conflict, especially around this. There will be anger and there's going to be conflict. The best way that I know of dealing with conflict around this is having really good listening conversations and repeating back what you hear people saying. Those two skills are huge. So when you're sitting there like, oh, I want to enter into a learning conversation, like tell me what you're feeling, what you're processing. Just let me know. And then free to be racist, free to be prejudiced, free to be whatever. And then I want to repeat back to you, reflect back what you're saying. So these are conversations that we've trained our church to have. So our community group is really angry at me because I said, you can't be, you can't, only white people can be racist. And you're like, that is so wrong. How in the world? That's just like such a racist thing to say, whatever, But tell me more. Tell me how you're feeling about that. Like, where's that coming from? Tell me and then repeating back what you hear and letting the other person change what they say if they're not being heard right. I think those two skills are really, really important. So learning, I want to learn how you feel, and then I want to reflect back to you what you're saying. Did I get it right? Yes. Okay, great. Do you feel heard? That's really, really important. It's like people feeling heard. So starting there and knowing that conflict doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with one another, but you have to hear each other. So I don't have to agree with you, but I do. You are worth being heard, and I want to make sure I hear you, and I want you to hear me. And we can disagree, but doesn't mean we have to leave each other, and we can work towards commonality. These are all really important emotional skills to have. And you can't always expect the other person to have them, so you should be leading in that. I try to do that. Lead in having these conversations. So, yeah, it's a good question. Conflict will happen. Can I pray for you guys? Yeah. Lord, I thank you for this group. I thank you for Westmont just engaging so deeply around this topic and this conversation. I pray the peace of Christ that tears down all kinds of walls to abide on this campus, abide on these students as they do the real gospel work of tearing down the system, calling into question the whole thing, and giving us a vision of the kingdom of God. May we lead through that, God. I know, we all know, that there needs to be budgets met, and there needs to be certain numbers hit and all that, and we can have them all. I believe in your kingdom we can have it all. We can have an abundance of fruitfulness, diversity, multicultural reality, and have everything we need. We can. You God are a God of abundance. There's no scarcity model with you, God. You rain manna from heaven. So would you do that here over and over again in all kinds of ways, God? Thank you, God. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.